But tonight's cafe conversation is Dr. Stan Alost from the School of Visual Communications. He's going to be talking about graphic images in news and politics. Oh, and before I forget, since I'm holding it, I always forget this part. This is the t-shirt for tonight. For those of you who don't know, you can earn or win, if whichever way you want to look at it, a t-shirt by interacting, asking questions, being here and doing something more than just listening.
Does that count me
It's
too?
all you. No, you
Oh,
don't.
dadgum.
It's all you.
Because I was going to listen. Good evening. My name is Stan Alost. I'm in the School of Visual Communication. I wanted to talk a little bit about disturbing images. I do want to bring this up at the beginning of the conversation because I will show you some images that I hope at some level you find disturbing. I know I do. Just a little background for what it's worth. I have a background. I've worked as a photojournalist for a number of years in a number of different publications. I've been a picture editor. I've done a lot of contract editing for the Associated Press. Did work with UPI. I've worked for newspapers and news organizations pretty much through the South. If you detect a bit of a accent that you have that I don't, that's because I'm not originally from here. You'd never guess that. But hopefully you can make your way through with it. So I wanted to talk about something that, as a journalistic practitioner, I still get emails from my mother that she's passing on from her friends that get me going, and I occasionally will pop off a rant just because I've spent so long at it. But let's kind of start somewhere. How many of you have a smartphone with pictures on it? And they're pictures of family, pets are still part of family, vacations, memories. In the old days, you would have a series of those stuck in your wallet, and now you can have a bunch more on your phone and share them with yourself. As human beings, we have this need to kind of document ourselves and the things that are important to us. It is just part of what we are. It goes back to some of our earliest recorded indications of human behavior. These are hand stencils they found in Indonesia relatively recently that are dating roughly around 40,000 years old. This, folks, is one of the first selfies. I was here. And then you could take people to the cave and point and say, see, I was here. See, that's my hand. See the stain on it? It was the first selfie. The idea that we as human beings are, one, social animals. We love to hang around other of our kind. We also don't get along well once we do. But we love to hang around others of our kind. But we also are trying to fit ourselves into where we are in this world, where we are in this life. Yeah, isn't that funny? Like they had really long, they were a piano player. They just didn't have a piano yet. We quickly moved on, and we find similar kinds of representations all around the world where early peoples were looking at the world around them and began to record, at least in something that has remained. I believe they probably were doing this beforehand. It's just they were not doing it on something that stayed. They tattooed it on their neighbor, and the neighbor moved. So whatever it was, people have been trying to document what they saw, what they experienced, so that they could share it. Because it's not just that you're taking a picture of your kids because you don't remember what they look like and you need to reference that occasionally. It's you want to show someone else. You want to have someone else have that same understanding, gain the knowledge, have the experience that you've had. So this is where we started. I'm going to leap forward because we don't have enough time to go through all of humankind history. Can you see it? This is the first permanent photograph. About 1837, Joseph Niepce, human beings were trying to record more and more accurate representations of what they saw. And there's some great writings about some of the early people that are coming up with photography as they talk about the devices that they had that would project whatever was in front of them on a piece of paper, and they're trying to draw it. And if you were about an artist like me, you absolutely couldn't make a decent drawing of what you had seen. William Fox Talbot, who came up with one of the other early inventions of photography, wrote about being on his honeymoon in Italy, and he's Englishman. He was out in Italy on his honeymoon, and he's out trying to draw pictures of this lake that they're visiting. And he talks about in his book, how frustrating it was, because every time he tries to get all the details, the paper moves, and then he can't get it. And he couldn't. And he says, I sat and thought how wonderful it would be if the image would just stay stuck on the piece of paper for me. That idea is what transcended into photography. This is a picture that Niepce created. He's French. This is looking out his garden window. To the left is part of his house. To the right is another part of the house, and you see fields beyond. How many people can see it? Yeah. So it wasn't an overwhelming success initially. But this is the first permanent photograph. The ability to make something that you see out there stick so that you can show it to someone else. Now, leap ahead a little bit, and Daguerre, who's often credited with creating the invention of photography, comes forward with his process, and all it is a process. You go buy the chemicals, you slap it on a piece of shiny metal, and you put it in this device that we have been using for drawing an aid, and you can record a picture. And then you have to stick it through a bunch of more chemicals that will eventually kill you, but, it makes a nice picture. He invents photography. And all of a sudden, the ability to record detailed moments in time that don't have the interpretation of an artist changes everything. All of a sudden, it's not an artist's impression of something. It's the thing in a moment. So we took pictures of things that were pretty for a very short time, and then we turned to things like life, which isn't always pretty, to the things that aren't. Hold that thought. Let's jump off into kind of where these two start to collide. In this country, the early kind of play out on what we were going to become, there were sort of two different ideas. One was that really the smart, rich landowner people were the ones that were smart enough and should make the decisions about the whole country. Guys. White guys. And then there was sort of this Jeffersonian ideal that was, if you take average people, white guys, if you take average people and you give them good information, as a group, they can make good decisions for the whole. That idea won out. The idea that and we eventually got around to figuring out that, those people should include everybody. It's amazing. If you let, women vote, things get better. If you let everybody vote, things get better. Everybody has a voice, and that is what is the root of democracy, is that an informed group of people can make the best decision about what that group of people should do. Now, there are lots of other ways that governments work. In a democracy, the idea is rooted in information, an informed public, an informed electorate. If you have that, they're supposed to be able to make good ideas, good decisions. So, photographs can be used to unveil the unpleasant. We know about pretty pictures. We like pretty pictures. They're all on our phone. We Instagram them. We tweet them. took pictures of leaves out in the yard the other day, and Weather Channel has picked it up because it was a tweeted picture of leaves in my yard. Oh, we want to use that. Okay, you don't have leaves in your yard? What's the problem? But we know about pretty pictures. The idea is that photography, because it captures a moment in time, we see that as true. Now, we all know pictures can lie. You've all had your portrait made. You look at what they give you, and you go, that's clearly not me. You know, it's just, I don't look like that. I don't sound like that. But the idea is that the way our brain works, because our brain is not one kind of thing, it is a bunch of little computers. There are different parts of the brain that process different parts of the information coming in. What we see takes up a huge portion of what we know about the world around us. More than half of our brain deals with visual information. Most of what we know is based on what we see. Think about your memories. Think about what you know. Think about how much of that is rooted in what you've seen. Even if the picture lies, if you've seen it, it is hard for you to forget it. And even if I come back and explain to you that that's really not Bill Clinton with someone else, they're just friends, it is impossible for you to get that mental image out of your head. There's lots of research that shows that imagery will affect how we process textual information. There's a wonderful experiment that was done that made up a fictitious news story about this disease that people were getting. And they changed out the picture that was associated with it. And in the text, it never said who was most likely to get this disease. But if you talk to people afterwards, after they read it, whoever was in the picture was who they believed was most likely to get the disease. They were sure that that was a fact, that they knew it, when it was not at all. It influences what we understand from the text that we read. So images have a way of working into your brain and your knowledge in ways that text doesn't. The other important part about images is in our processing, as images go into our head, they pass through the thalamus that's connected to our emotions. It's part of why you physically respond to something kind of flying at your head before you ever know what it is. I mean, have you ever ducked really hard and it was a little fly, but all you saw was something flying at your head and so you ducked? It is because of the way our processing system works. Images as well as sound are really connected closely, biologically, to our emotional system. So you see something and you'll respond emotionally faster and oftentimes more than the same thing conveyed in words. That's the power of pictures. So, we've got in photography. We've invented photography. It now is kind of making better images. Within a few years after the invention, we start seeing it used. Some of the earliest war photography is done in the Mexican-American War, 1840s. Most of what they took pictures of were empty streets after some army had gone through, but it was considered the first round of war photography. Then we see it used in the Crimean War, where their photographers are actually going out close to the time that they've had a battle and making some images, but they're not out there during the battle. We get to the Civil War, and we start seeing photography used to document the people involved in war, including depicting death. Now, prior to this, death often was shown in sort of more grandiose sort of ways, and it was a painting, too. It was less real. And we get to these pictures like this image from Gettysburg. You'll often find it marked as a Brady image, when actually it was one of Brady's photographers that made it. But we get to this kind of imagery that helps people understand what war really ends up being like. Here's the problem. The printing presses of the time were not able to reproduce photographs. So we have the pictures, but for you to have that understanding, you had to go to the art gallery to see the pictures. And if you weren't in New York or Washington, D.C., you're not likely to see the pictures, so you don't get the knowledge. Well, it doesn't take us long to figure out how to reproduce images, and by then we're understanding how impactful images can be. And we start seeing work like Lewis Hine, Jacob Riis, where photographers are documenting social problems in this country, and the images are being reproduced for a mass audience. People are getting the visual information, in this case, of the work environment for kids. Based on that knowledge and information, Congress wrote some of the child labor laws, begin to address social ills, in part because people had a chance to see little kids working in a factory, barefoot, around some pretty nasty looking machinery. Probably not where you want your kids playing. So it begins to have change. The images provide information that helps create change. This country goes through several other wars, but the photography typically was more in support of what was going on. It was more done as a support to the military effort, in part just because of the national conscience. We get to Vietnam, and the idea of photojournalism, the idea of telling and reporting a story visually, has really begun to grow. And we see photojournalists going into the field in Vietnam and documenting war in ways that people weren't really used to seeing. And because these images are now being spread to the populace, people begin to second guess the involvement. And we see a real division within this country, but we also see a movement towards making a change. And it is based in part on these kinds of images. This is Eddie Adams' picture, South Vietnamese officer general. They've caught what they believed was a Viet Cong spy, lieutenant in the Viet Cong military in Saigon. And there's actually film of this where the general walks up, pulls his pistol out, shoots him, puts his pistol away, and walks on. It's this still image that sticks with people and was part of what shaped change in public opinion and government response in Vietnam. About the same time, we see the same kind of work being done looking at racial issues, particularly in the South. Charles Moore is widely recognized for his work. He was a white newspaper photographer in Montgomery, Alabama. He began photographing the civil rights marches. That imagery began to help people across the country realize how we were treating each other. And it began to affect change. There's another photograph I didn't show that also had a huge effect. There was a young boy from Chicago, Emmett Till. He was down visiting relatives in Mississippi. And he and his friends went off to the grocery store and were hanging out outside the grocery store because what else do you do in the evening in Mississippi? And the stories differ exactly what happened, but the white woman that was running the store, at some point, Emmett Till whistles at her suggestively. The woman's husband isn't there. Next night or so, he and his brother-in-law, if I remember right, show up at the uncle's house in the middle of the night, at gunpoint and take the little boy to teach him a lesson. And they taught him a lesson by beating the tar out of him until they eventually killed him, wrapped wire around his neck, and threw him in the river. They eventually find the body, and they ship it up to Chicago for his mother to bury. Once she saw him, she insisted on an open casket funeral because she wanted people to see what had been done to her 11-year-old boy. There were photographs, particular photograph made of him, particularly head and shoulders, and that image was widely circulated. But at the time, it's widely circulated in the African American community because mainstream media didn't use it. It's a really disturbing image, and it really gave a tremendous boost to the civil rights movement that then leads to a lot of this kind of work by Charles Moore that eventually gets us to begin to change, not done changing, but begin to change how we deal with each other in this country. So this brings me to what I consider as the misconception number one. Newspapers and magazines use graphic images to sell more copies, to sell more papers. How many of you have at least heard that? I'm not going to ask you to raise hands if you believe it, but bear with me. Let's do the math. To make things easier for myself, I did the math with a calculator ahead of time. So, on average, a newspaper sells so many newspapers a day. Some of those sales are subscription. Somebody that's already given their money, say, send me the newspaper to my house every day. They're going to get it whether they intended to or not that day. What we talk about as single copy sales or rack sales. Somebody that's walking through the Speedway and see it and decide to pick it up and buy it. Those are single copy sales. I pulled 3 newspapers. Now this data comes from the Neiman Lab 2015 survey. In Dayton, on average, a single daily sales account for about 5,000 copies. In Denver, it's about 7,500 copies. In New York, where you would expect a lot of people walking, a lot of people more likely to pick up, they'll do 168,000 on a day, on average. Okay, bear with me. It's math, not my strong suit. Let's just say a newspaper costs $1. Okay? If you say, I put a graphic picture on the front, and 20% more people are going to pick it up because of this graphic picture, what does that translate into in money? Well, for Dayton, that's $1,000. For Denver, it's $1,500. Okay, $33,600. That's not chump change. But, all in all, for that company, $33,000 is not a major amount of money. Here's the problem. So for every person that picks it up because of the picture, how many people do you think don't pick it up because of the picture? Well, as soon as one doesn't pick it up for one that did, you're back where you started. And for every subscriber that picks up their paper, doesn't like the picture, and cancels your subscription, you're out way more money because they were paying you every day anyway. Having worked at a number of news organizations, having been a part of the decision to publish a number of very disturbing images through my years, I can tell you the idea that we were going to sell more newspapers because we put the picture of some poor dead person on the cover was never part of the conversation. Ever. Because we know that as soon as you do it, you're likely to lose readers. So, this brings me to what we call the Cheerios Test. It's a phrase used in news organizations that talk about, will readers lose their Cheerios because of the picture in the paper? Most of the time people are eating breakfast. they see something that's very disturbing, or is it going to really upset them? News organizations really wring their hands a lot over a decision to publish. It's usually never an individual's decision. It's usually a group decision. Having been involved in, for example, in St. Petersburg, Florida, there was a gentleman who lost it for whatever reason. He worked at a hotel over near Tampa, and he went in the middle of the day with a pistol, and he started shooting his coworkers. Now, this was a big swank hotel, and he started out by the pool, shot the guy that working at the pool, started walking through and walk in, here's a housekeeper here, someone else in the lobby that was working, just started shooting people among the guests. He knew who he was after, went out, hijacked a car, started driving through Tampa. That car broke down. He got out in the middle of the week, middle of the day, middle of a relatively affluent area, starts trying to steal cars. One lady who's sitting at the red light, he goes over and bangs and starts screaming at her, and she looks at him, and he goes, boom, shoots her through the window, kills her. Eventually takes another car, goes a little bit further, and the police surround him, and he gives up without a fight, like nothing had happened that day at all. We go through to try to help our audience understand the tremendous loss of life and how absolutely unthinkable and random it was to people who really had nothing to do with anything. And so how do you convey that to an audience? And one of the images that we came down to was the woman who had been shot, and went through the long discussion with other editors, decide this is what we're going to do. The next editor comes in, we go through the same conversation, went through that conversation 5 times with a growing larger group of people until we all came to the same conclusion. It is a disturbing picture. It is not pleasant to look at. But the event was unpleasant and disturbing. And we wanted our readers to understand that, because it raises the question, question we still have in our society, how do we deal with this? Is it about guns? Is it about mental illness? Here are all these things that we as a society really need to talk about. Because we as a group with information can make a better decision. So, yep.
What was the outcome? How did the public react to that photo? I'm curious.
Good question. Mike,
Repeat the question, by the way.
the question is, how did the audience respond? Having worked in the business, that one in particular, not much response at all. It's not that people didn't care. It's people understood why. And we also go to great lengths to help our audience understand why. Editors realize that we are a guest in someone's home. I can't remember the exact phrase Walter Cronkite used to use, but he talked about being a guest in your home. We realize that media, particularly news media, are a real option for most people. People will give up the newspaper before they'll give up their Xbox, before they'll give up their Facebook. So we recognize that. We also recognize that, people are more willing to accept disturbing images when it comes through social media than when it comes through the media. So in that case, not many people called in. We had some other cases where people were upset. And the thing that I found through the years was I want to talk to them. I want to listen. And then I want to walk people through the decision process. Help people realize that as an editor, you look at things that disturb you. You look at a lot of pictures that they won't see, because it's a fine line between giving you information that you can accept and giving you information that you can't stand to look at. And if I turn you away before you get the information, I don't get you to think about it. So it's a fine line. Having the conversation with people and helping them understand. The sister, there was a horrendous accident. Police chasing these kids in a stolen car, and the kids came off the interstate at a high rate of speed, run through a red light, hit a van on the side, and the guy that was in the van gets ejected, and he hits a guy wire and is decapitated and in really a mess. And so the photographer ended up with a picture of a shoe in the foreground, the driver's shoe in the foreground. It's not bloody or anything, it's just his tennis shoe, and the van and the mess and the police and all the other stuff in the background. And his family members, particularly his sister, called the next day just irate that we had been very disrespectful of him, and actually went through several phone calls with her in conversation and listening. And I think once she realized that part of the reason that we chose to publish the picture was to help people understand the loss, and that this was someone that meant something to other people, and that I didn't run it because I was trying to sell more copies. I didn't publish it because I didn't care, that it was disturbing. It was disturbing to me. And I'll tell you, as a picture editor, I have sat many a night looking at pictures from around the world and cry, because it is amazing what people will do to each other. So it's, how do you get that information across? This was the first recorded, this was the first woman executed by the electric chair. I was up in Sing Sing, and a observer hit a camera taped to his leg, and he pulled his pants leg up and slipped the picture. But I think about what it took for these editors to decide to run that image. Most publications now would not run an image of an execution in this country, because we don't want to see what we do. So I find that an interesting. Misconception number 2. Photojournalists are hard-hearted. They don't care about anything but getting the picture. I want to point to 2 folks. One is, this is a quote from James Knockway, who's probably one of the most world-recognized conflict photographers. That's him photographing a man shooting an AK-47, and you can see everybody else is hit the ground because they're exchanging gunfire, and he's trying to get a better image. James Knockway has walked through more really bad situations as a photojournalist, but he genuinely believes his role is to help the world understand things they wouldn't otherwise. So he is willing to go in harm's way to get an image to help you understand the people and the circumstances somewhere else. The other person I will point to is Chris Hondros. Chris Hondros is alumni of OU. He was a VisCom student, graduate student. He was actually one of my classmates. He's a year ahead of me. Chris Hondros was another person who believed strongly that it was important that people have a chance to see what was going on in other countries, understand other cultures and the conflicts, particular as it related to U.S. policy. This is an image from Iraq. He was on patrol with a U.S. Group. They're out on a night patrol, and they're in the city, and a car is coming towards them, and they start yelling for the car to stop, and the car doesn't stop, and they fired a couple warning shots, and the car didn't stop, and so they open up on the car. And it was a man and his wife and their kids. Why he didn't stop is not apparent. No bombs in the car or anything like that. He was trying to take his family somewhere. Killed the parents, wounded a couple of the kids, but this little girl, her parents' blood splattered all over her. And so this is what Chris Hondros wanted people to understand. It's not a point of view of whether it's right or wrong. It's you need to understand the implications of what we decide to do. He wants you to have the information. It was so important to Chris that he was in Libya, covering the conflict there. Chris was killed by the Libyan army, and so he lost his life trying to make sure that people in this country particularly understood what was going on somewhere else. So the idea that photojournalists are hard-hearted, I don't believe. Are there people out there that don't care, that shoot pictures, that are not bothered by it? Yeah, absolutely. But I can tell you that most of the people that get into this business would rather not take a picture of someone that's dead. I can tell you as a photojournalist, I have walked through what used to be people at the site of a Pan Am plane crash just outside of New Orleans, where a plane taking off hit a wind shear and dropped into a neighborhood. And I still to this day have difficulty talking about and remembering what was there. But it was important for people to understand what happened, because the airport had tried to save some money, they actually had, by not purchasing wind shear detection devices. They're about $20,000 a piece. They would have had to have bought 4 of them. They saved the money. Getting people to realize the implications of what we do, the cost of it. Seeing brings you a level of understanding that's different than reading. I could have told you about this little girl, but it doesn't resonate the same way with you as seeing her. But I also want to remind you that we've been depicting harsh treatment. This is from an illuminated Bible from the medieval times. I think it's out of Italy from, I believe, the 10th century. So we've been presenting graphic images to ourselves to help people understand things for a long time. The differences with photography, we perceive it differently. We perceive it as more real. Unlike video, that can also be as compelling, a still image doesn't go away. And it sits there in front of you and makes you think. Questions? Comments? Heavy topic? Yes, sir.
You used the Daily News a couple times in your presentation, and surely the photojournalism at the Daily News in New York has a different audience or a different expectation than the one at the Dayton Herald or whatever it is. That picture of the execution, are you sure that wasn't put out there to sell newspapers?
I was not part of that. Yeah, the question is, was the Daily News image of the execution, because there's a different audience, there's a different consumer there. I would also argue, not only is the consumer different, I love it when my mother talks about, the media. I go, but that's me. The media is made up of people like us. The people working at the Columbus Dispatch are going to have more in common with you than the people working in New York. What is appropriate for your audience in New York is different than what's appropriate for your audience here. Did they do it to sell papers? I don't know that they did or didn't. I know that there's an understanding that when you might sell some, you also might not sell, and you might lose subscription. Now, are there publications that are drawing an audience because of the type of material they present? National Enquirer, absolutely. They, for some reason, are always able to find, the monkey child, the way the rest of the media can't find them. There are some news organizations that clearly have a different presentation on their news because it's always about the truth. And if you've been at this long enough, there's not a truth. It's multiple truths. It's about getting information. And I would also say never rely on a single source for all your information. But media is made up of people like us that care, that have some of the same kinds of things. Yes?
I'm curious, you said that you would get response by people phoning that they were upset about a picture. Do papers generally do focus groups, or are there other avenues besides poll to get the information?
The question is about whether or not we have other ways, does media have other ways of getting audience perceptions, responses, rather than just having them call in. One of the great difficult things about social media is that it has opened up the potential for having more streams of information and feedback and dialogue. You'll find a lot of writers now will be open to dialogue with their audience about things. I think it adds to the transparency, which is a good thing. We always talk about, how much do you explain why you chose this picture to an audience, and how much of that becomes self-serving. I think, that's part of it. But because of the nature of news, you usually don't get a chance to test out and ask people. Although I can tell you as a picture editor, one of the things I would do is go through the building and find people that weren't in the newsroom, and go find the maintenance guy, go find the lady down at the receptionist desk. What do you think of this? What do you see? What do you respond to? Really good news organizations expand the discussion rather than contract it. I was with a publication once when we had a picture of someone after they had been executed, and we were questioning whether or not to run it. And the discussion started among 5 editors, and we were sitting in one corner of the newsroom, and we started, and the next thing I knew, I'm sitting there, and there were 50-something people gathered around, passionately discussing whether or not we should do this. And it really, much like democracy, it gave rise to really good discussion so that you can make a better answer. You can make an informed decision. So there's not a real clear-cut way that I know of that most news organizations go out on something like that. You also run the risk of asking someone, would you want me to publish this? I mean, do you really want to see the picture of the Iraqi girl? Do you really want me to back up to that? The other thing that I come back to is pictures from 9/11. If you notice, most news organizations don't really touch those images anymore. Why? Because they are just very disturbing for us right now. What we found was people weren't objecting to the publication or airing of images immediately following. You understood. You were wanting to know. You wanted to know. How did you get to know? You saw. And you see people jumping to their death. You understand something that's really difficult, but you get something from it. But do you want to see it again? No. Do you need to? Probably not, because if you've seen that image, you probably will never have to see it again because it's stuck in your head. power of picture. So does that answer? Yes, sir.
You talked about the photograph back, going back to the photo of the woman being executed.
Yes.
That, of course, was photographed in combination with dramatic text.
Yes.
On the execution. How do you think what they chose to do with that text in combination with that photo comes into?
So the question is, because I talked about we process textual information and visual information separately, this is a combination of the two. Text can be powerful. We don't process it the same way. I think most of the time when publications get into trouble with their audiences, it's that pairing that gets them in trouble. It's what we say about what's going on in the picture that creates a problem. In that case, I think the editors, having been in sort of similar situations, not the same picture, I think we're people too, and responding the same sort of way of, oh my goodness.
I mean, and my reaction to that is they were certainly boosting the, if you want to call it sensationalistic aspect of that with the way they treated that text.
But if you think,
Toning it down, that's
but the response and the reason that they went out on the limb, I mean, if you're going to do it, do it. And I think they're doing it because it was such an event. I'm trying to find the right word that's not politically leaning one way or the other. It is a significant thing. That's the first woman. It is the first woman electrocuted. It had been a long time since a woman had been executed in this country, and it was there in New York. So it's really having been in places where things of significant magnitude happen. Maybe in retrospect there might have been a different way, but I think you see journalists responding in the moment the same way people on the street were responding of, oh my goodness. Think about headlines from 9/11. Think about headlines, Katrina from that area. Think about how people respond in that moment. You had a question, sir?
Yeah. There is this Spanish former war journalist.
Hmm?
His name is Arturo Pérez Reverte, and he covered many wars during a long time, and after a while he retired, but he mentioned, and now he's a novelist, but he mentions that of course there's a lot of what you showed us, a lot of you get to see the real face of humankind in these extreme situations. But he also mentions that he at the end he was struggling a lot because not really because of what he was covering, but because of what, as you were saying, people get their papers in the morning, they're eating their cereal, they see this picture, they maybe are affected for a couple of seconds, and then they leave it and they go back to eating their papers and eating their cereal. He mentioned that the way news are covered today and the ways a lot of the pictures and things and the reaction from the public, even if we have hard images as the ones that you showed, were really disappointing. But he was really struggling with that. So I wanted to ask you if you have felt that way at some point, heard your colleagues feeling that way about the reaction of the people about these things, and isn't that frustrating sometimes, or how do you deal with it?
Let me see if I can condense that one. Referencing a Spanish war correspondent who covered a number of conflicts that began to become disillusioned because the audience was not deeply affected in the same way that he felt like maybe they should be. at least in American journalism, you're not trying to tell people what to think. You're trying to get them to think about something. Whatever their decision is their decision. You want them to think about it. And there's actually research that says that your closely held beliefs, no matter what I do as the media, I'm not going to change your closely held beliefs. If you think Barack Obama is an idiot, there's nothing I'm going to be able to show you or do that will change your mind. If you think he is the greatest thing ever, there's nothing I can do or show you that's going to change your mind. But if I keep showing it to you, I will at least get a mass audience to begin to think about it. What they decide is different. It is disturbing in a lot of ways. I have been at this a while. There's no single image that's going to change everything. There's no single story that's going to change everything. But they can have an effect. Abu Ghraib prison. It had been reported what was going on there before. It had been reported on by multiple sources before. The New Yorker gets their hands on images, and all of a sudden, response changes. That's on a national and international level. I also worked at a publication where Homeowners Association, there's a little boy who has leukemia, and he and his dad build a treehouse in their backyard. It is the safe haven for this little boy to go to. He's going through treatments for leukemia. It is painful. Even in his room, he's got IVs and everything. It's his little safe haven that he and his dad built, a place for him to get away. Homeowners Association comes along and says, here's court order, cease and desist, take it down because it sticks partially above the fence and it's going to degrade the value of the neighborhood homes. So the family and their attorney were trying to fight it. They call a press conference. Media shows up, talk to the parents in the front yard, round and round, round and round. Everybody leaves. And the photojournalist that I was working with, Mike Peace, hung out longer, and he hung out with a kid, and the kid took him in the backyard and was showing him the treehouse and all, and he's sitting in the backyard with a kid, and they're talking about the treehouse, and, you know, what is he going to do? And the little kid starts crying and does his hands to his face. And Mike made an image. Not an insensitive, uncaring. He captured a genuine moment of distress from this kid. As a picture editor, occasionally you get these pictures that come in and you see it and you go, wow. It's like, this is going on the front page. And news airs it, TV airs it at night. Next morning, newspaper hit the pavement. And by noon, the attorney for the Homeowners Association was standing down at the courthouse, wringing his hand, and go, oh, we've made a mistake. So it doesn't always change everything, everybody, all the time. Where people were inundated with information and visual stimulus all the time. But it is one way to get information to a community, to a culture, to a country, to help people make decisions, to make good decisions. You hope they're good decisions. I'll come right back. Yes?
Do you have any examples of your own work or do you talk about that you consider the most powerful pictures that you've taken?
I didn't bring, the question was whether or not I brought some own work. I didn't, I didn't bring any of that. I tend not to, just because I've worked with some amazing people, and I think these are broader examples. And I don't want to go back to the... As a journalist, I am more than willing to champion disturbing people with pictures when there's a reason. I really thought long and hard about what images I would bring and show and walk through. I didn't go down the Abu Ghraib prison route because I didn't feel like it was really necessary. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious. A lot of photography is done in color, but a lot of print is done in black and white. And so how does people's perceptions and the reactions to photos change depending if it's all color or if it's black and white? And sometimes how do you make that decision which of the media to use?
The question is about deciding whether to publish an image as color or black and white, or even sometimes where it gets used, so that would, or to choose not to. I will answer that in a two-part. One is, one of the interesting things about our physiology is that our eyeballs are structured with two sets of cells, two different types of cells. One's really kind of noticing contrast, black and white. The other is color, and in our brain, we are hardwired to pay attention to color. It is important to us. We can't ignore color. We can't ignore movement either, which is why those little ads jump around on the side of your Facebook page or something, because you try to ignore it, but you can't. Or they'll use bright colors because you can't ignore them. So how we perceive an image and the content, how we read an image, because you read an image in the same way you read text. You enter it at a particular point based on lots of different kinds of things. There's a face, we're drawn to a face, we can't help it. Or color. So deciding whether or not the color is adding content, is it adding information, or is it additional, is it a run-on sentence that you want to pull it away so that people get the meaning out of the image as opposed to getting caught up in the color. I've gone down both sides of that. Particularly, there was one picture once out of South Africa where people had put a tire full of gasoline around somebody's neck and set it on fire, and then were commencing to hit him with the machetes. And the question was whether or not we would publish it in color or black and white. And I felt like the color added information. Fire in black and white doesn't scare you the same way that seeing fire in yellow and red around somebody's neck does in color. The flip side of that was we also had a picture once of manatees. This was in Florida that had been killed by boat propellers, and they had them in a manatee morgue, and it was these large number of manatees. And what I wanted people to understand was the numbers and the cuts and the amount of red from blood was so overwhelming that people got caught up looking at the blood, and they didn't pay attention to the numbers of manatees. And that's one where you took it around and said, "What do you see? Tell me what you saw. Show it to you. What did you see?" It's a bunch of blood. It's a bunch of blood. Okay. Take the black and white around, and people are like, "Oh, look at all the manatees." I want people to see the numbers. I want them to understand that. I want them to understand in this boating community where running your speedboat down these little canals was killing manatees. And you can count the number of manatees left in the world. You can count the number of manatees left in the world. Does it kill you not to drive your boat really fast? Really? That's editorializing. But the point was to get people to understand numbers. So, yes and no. I'm getting the hook from the corner.
Anybody else? One last question, maybe?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you were regarding that electrocution picture, and you were talking about how editors select pictures really because they want you to understand what's going on. Having lived in New York for 15, 16 years, passed by an awful lot of newsstands, the New York Daily News and the Post. It seems to me like those editors do take a different view, and they do want to have a big picture on the front to appeal to one just to make you stop and want to pick up that paper, and not to really inform you?
Having not worked for either of those organizations, I won't begin to guess what they decide. It is true that you're trying to attract attention. I mean, if you're for newsstand sales, you're trying to attract attention. National Geographic changes out the cover image depending on whether it's a circulation, home delivery, or whether it's a newsstand. And there are other publications that will change it out depending on the region because of the audience and what's going to get people to pay attention. Because if I don't get you to buy it, I can never get you the information. So using a really large image, because we're attracted to pictures, is going to attract your attention. Now, are they trying to appeal to the darker side of humanity? You know, I won't speak for them. I know that most news organizations don't.
I would agree that most don't, but I think those two papers are unique in this country.
But papers that operate, we don't see it much anymore, but papers that operate in a competitive environment sometimes behave differently in the same way that car dealerships across the street from each other will behave differently than somewhere else. Having worked in environments where there was sincere competition, it made me as a photojournalist behave differently. I worked for an afternoon paper early in my career, and when I worked in the afternoon. So when I got to work, the paper was already out, which meant anything that I shot today, people were going to see in the morning paper in the morning, we're going to see on the news that night. So it compelled me to try and take the reader somewhere where they wouldn't go or couldn't go, which meant when the fire department went to a fire and everyone else was standing out in front of the house photographing, I would go around and crawl over the fence and go into the back of the burning house and photograph the firemen. Yeah, it wasn't the smartest things necessarily, but the police officers going into the woods in the manhunt, and they jump in the truck trying to go after this guy that had shot at a deputy. And so I'd bail into the back of the truck with him to go out in the woods with him, after somebody that's shooting at people. Wasn't always necessarily the smart decision. But good photojournalism will take you visually somewhere where you can't or wouldn't go. Or you show you something that's common in an uncommon way. And that's the idea of giving you information. It isn't always pleasant. It isn't always pretty. Do some people mistreat it, misuse it? Absolutely. Thank you all very, very much.